The fabric of American life has kind of changed since technology took off. In the way back past, let's say 30, 40 years ago, let's pick that. People, by and large, had to show up at work if they had a job. They couldn't stay home and work remotely. By and large, if somebody didn't come out of their house for 5 days, somebody would notice and go knock on their door and say, hey, is everything okay? But now if somebody doesn't come out of their house for 5 days, everybody assiduously doesn't pay any attention, and many other people are not coming out of their houses either, or their apartments. So there is a sort of change which could be characterized as everybody's so preoccupied with staying busy and being productive that they do not privilege socializing as very important. They are busy with self-care and health. They are busy with making money at a job. They are busy with contributing to society's betterment, supposedly. But they kind of forget to stay connected because that doesn't have an immediate, clear reward, except if you let yourself relax and have fun. And so, to some extent, the emphasis on loneliness as an important health problem has been a boon because it sort of reminds people, well, if you just consider that, your seventh priority, it's just as dangerous for you as smoking cigarettes and never exercising.
You had written a book called The Lonely American, Drifting Apart in the 21st Century. First off, why this title? I mean, why focus particularly on American loneliness and why the 21st century? Is there something uniquely lonely about that class of people?
Well, when we were asked to write the book, that was thought through. Essentially, there had been something called the General Social Survey that had been, it's given every 18 to 20 years, and it had just been given when we were asked whether we might write this book. And it said that something like a quarter of the people who were asked the question, have you talked about anything of importance to anyone over the last 6 months, about 24.5% of the people said no. And even when they, were asked, well, did you write anything? Because so many people communicate on text or email, they said no. And this was a huge change from the past when it was more like 9%. And similarly, when you asked people how many confidants they had, and this was just an American survey, they had formerly said in the last survey that they had an average of 3 people that they could talk to and really be themselves, and that went down to 2. So essentially the number of confidants went down by a third, and the not speaking to anybody about anything important had gotten to be a much bigger percentage over the 6-month period. So those were the kind of survey facts that made people think this is a new era, and there is a huge number of people experiencing loneliness in the country. And so they wondered if we might write a book explaining that, or essentially explaining our theories about that, since my husband and I, had been in psychiatric practice for 40-odd years apiece. And so they thought maybe we would have noticed the trend. And actually we had, because we'd written a book in 1996 called Overcoming Loneliness in Everyday Life. And that was a book back then where we talked about wanting to bring loneliness out of the closet. And by that we meant we didn't want people to feel so embarrassed and ashamed about feeling lonely, because it's a universal experience at times. And that so many of our patients were willing to essentially adopt or request all sorts of diagnoses, but not even mention that they felt horribly lonely for, often many sessions. And we discovered it when it would have been much more helpful to talk about it from the get-go.
That's interesting that you say that people came in requesting diagnoses, but not even mentioning the core fact, excuse me, of loneliness.
Right.
Do you think that there's some debate that we overdiagnose and overprescribe? Do you think that many of the mental health issues that we see in America today can be attributed to this loneliness?
Well, I actually do think that. I think that, for example, substance abuse is a gigantic problem, but you could trace it in many people to the fact that they feel so lonely that they turn to something they can totally control, like a substance, and they get addicted to it because they're essentially dying of loneliness. And so that's one whole category of diagnoses. Anxiety and depression are both heightened when people feel lonely over time. Now, there are certain illnesses like bipolar illness or schizophrenia, which are not, or Alzheimer's, not explainable in that way at all.
Right.
But for some of the huge numbers of people on antidepressants or anxiety medication or using alcohol or pot to sort of medicate themselves, I think many of them are coping with loneliness.
Yeah. You also mentioned in there that you had seen, just in your own practice, a rise in loneliness among your patients. In what ways did that trend manifest itself to you?